One of the first slave ships that brought black people to the New World was named Jesus. White Christians used Bible verses and Bible stories to justify slavery. There was a time when white Christians wouldn't baptize black people because they weren't sure if it was okay to enslave Christians. They quickly changed their theology, baptized their black slaves, and forthrightly sent them back to the fields to work. 4, both black and white prosperity preachers have scammed millions of dollars from faithful black parishioners living in American slums. 5, it is an undeniable fact that Christianity has been a tool of oppression for black people all throughout the world. And yet today, Black Americans identify as Christians at a staggering 79%, higher than any other group in this country. So the question is, why are Black people still Christians? And while we're at it, I actually think there's a more pressing, more existential question that needs an answer. Does God hate Black people? In nearly every country on every continent around the world, darker-skinned people are treated poorly. By nearly every measurable standard, so-called Black people are at the bottom of the social hierarchy everywhere. So much so that in majority Black countries like Haiti and Nigeria, skin lightening creams are wildly popular. Anything to gain some proximity to whiteness and some distance from Blackness. Africa is rich with natural resources, boundless human potential, unfathomable wisdom, and brilliant cultural traditions. And yet, colonial powers have pillaged, exploited, and divided nations and people in ways that are frankly irreparable, all without consequence. I mean, I don't know. You'd think that God would help us out a little bit. We've been through a lot, God. Maybe there's a Bible verse that we can look to. And the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You shall be above only and not be beneath. Who is this verse about? Not only do Black people identify as Christians at a higher rate, half of Black Americans report attending church at least once a week. I was one of them. In fact, I was a pastor for a number of years. I've preached all over the country and world. I've given Bible studies. I've baptized folks. I have been in it, and these questions have been nagging me for a while. So in this video, we're going to get some answers. I talked to a couple of people. One of them is my friend Claudia.
My name is Claudia Allen.
She is easily one of the most conscious people I know. She's well-read, tapped into history and literature, a person who is thinking about race, class, and power in very critical ways. But she's also a Christian, a preacher, and a committed member of her church.
There is no other people group on the face of the planet who has experienced the kind of suffering that is akin to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ like Black and brown people. No other group.
Since she is well aware of what's happening in the world, I wanted to hear her reasons for keeping the faith. But I also spoke to Dr. Anthony B. Penn.
Well, my birth name is Anthony Bernard Penn, but most folks over the course of my life called me Tony.
He's a religious scholar, former pastor just like me, and now an atheist. And I think his perspective is important in this conversation.
Where is the historical evidence to support the claim that God is on the side of the oppressed, right? What is the historical evidence that suggests God is on the side of Black folks in North America working on their behalf? Because every moment of progress has been countered.
And if you stick around at the end, I'll share how I'm thinking about my faith today. So let's dig in. I first encountered Dr. Penn's work when I was in seminary. I couldn't find the exact article that I read way back when, but it essentially argued that there is no God. But if there was a God, he clearly hated Black people.
Does God hate Black people? I mean, I think that's an important question, a question that too many Black theists have ignored. Right? If you look at our experience, it is overwhelmingly tied to suffering. And true, all folks suffer, but this is disproportionate and unto death. And it ought to force us to raise the question, if God is loving, kind, just, and compassionate, and concerned with folks and can make stuff happen, and Black folks still suffer disproportionately, then maybe that God doesn't like Black people. Because white folks in general, right, as a group, seem to be doing all right. Black folks as a whole, not doing so well. And forget about the kind of misery that Black women face. Or Black trans folks. Forget about that kind of misery. Just in general, there is an overwhelming experience of misery. And again, if God is loving, kind, just, compassionate, concerned with folks and can make stuff happen, and black folks are disproportionately suffering, then maybe God doesn't like black folks. It's a question that's got to be wrestled with. And black Christians in particular haven't wrestled with it because they read the Bible assuming they are the favored community. Right? They are the equivalent of the children of Israel. But if you look at our experience in the context of North America, you can make a reasonable argument, perhaps a more reasonable argument, that we are the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Hittites, the folks who get a whooping. Right? So it seems to me that is a question that is central, that has to be wrestled with, but black theists have ignored it.
On the other hand, Christians like Claudia would argue that Dr. Penn is wrong and that the life of Jesus is proof that he is wrong.
The reason I would say there is a case for Christ as black, as resin, and not necessarily racially, gotta be clear, not necessarily racially black, but experientially black. And that case is that this God put on human flesh, and when he was born in the midst of a genocide, flees to Egypt with his parents as a refugee seeking asylum, to then grow up in a working class community of Nazareth, black and brown people who were had no socioeconomic wealth or political position or station. And this brown man who hid in Egypt literally goes about the Gaza Strip teaching brown people about Creator God. He was disrupting the cultural system of not speaking to women. He disrupted the cultural system of not engaging with the unlearned. He touched the lepers. He healed the sick. And then because he did all of those things, he is falsely accused and he's arrested in the middle of the night. And we just got out of Easter weekend, right? They take him, all right? And he's literally before the Sanhedrin. They are desperately trying to pin him for a crime he did not commit. He dies in the middle of two criminals with the greatest, grossest execution known to human history. There is no other people group on the face of the planet who has experienced the kind of suffering that is akin to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ like black and brown people. No other group in human history. And what is fascinating about that to me, Garrison, is that black and brown people make up 80% of humanity on the globe. A very small minority group is currently experiencing global power. And their lived experience is not that of a crucified Savior. It is that of a Roman and religious power. That is why we can say, like James Cone, that Jesus was black.
I grew up in the West End of Atlanta, which means that for as long as I can remember, I've heard Hebrew Israelites and 5%ers and folks in the Nation of Islam describe Christianity as the white man's religion. This idea that black Christians were essentially worshiping the God of their oppressor. And Claudia had something to say about the history of Christianity in black or African possession.
I think everyone knows that Ethiopia has always been a Christian nation. But Ethiopia also was at this really important intersection of international trade. We get Ethiopia as this Christian nation because they had constant contact with the direct disciples of Jesus Christ who were eyewitnesses to his life, death, and resurrection. But then even outside of Ethiopia, even if we go to Ghana with the Akan people, who also had their own creation narrative that is very similar to the creation narrative of the Hebrew scriptures, where they even named the creator God, the God of Saturday, right? So there has always been this very present belief in the Judeo-Christian God on the continent far prior to the Portuguese first coming to take slaves in 1471.
And while Christianity has been an incredibly powerful and positive force in the Black community, nurturing our most progressive and effective voices, it's impossible to ignore the most regressive elements present in the faith.
Well, from very early on, Black church figures tried to publicly reimagine the position of Black folks within the context of the United States, yeah? So one of my favorites is Henry McNeil Turner. Henry McNeil Turner in the late 1800s in Atlanta, Georgia, argued that God is a Negro. Pause. 1800s, Atlanta, Georgia, God is a Negro. He also argued that the flag of the United States is a dirty rag and will remain so until Black folks are treated properly. So you get these sorts of figures who are moving between the church and political life, right? He holds several appointments. Other ministers are moving into political office. And then you move through the decades and you get someone like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., right? So you get churches that are sure enough involved in the political process. And this was fruitful, one, because these churches were economically independent. So these ministers, by and large, could work for the well-being of Black folks without worrying about paychecks. The Black church was the first organization for and by Black folks. So the church becomes an easy mechanism Black folks could use to be involved. It gave them a theology that included them. They were made in the image of God. Yes, that Black folks had deep importance and significance, and provided them with opportunities to live that in public, both as individuals and as a collective. So the Black church has played that sort of role, but the Black church has played that role almost exclusively in relationship to race. So it hasn't dealt well with issues of gender and sexism. Forget about its ability to deal with sexuality. What happens to a trans population within Black churches, right? So they worked hard to try to get race right, but we are not one-dimensional beings, right? We are not beings who are simply defined by anti-Blackness in terms of race. There are a variety of ways in which this society has tried to marginalize, if not kill us, and Black churches have been reluctant to address that. I think one of the shortcomings of Black churches, why they have not been willing to engage a much more expansive agenda, is because of respectability politics. If we look like white folks, if we sound like white folks, if we structure our individual and collective lives in ways that mimic white folks, they will have to appreciate us. So we've reached a point again where Black churches, the dominance of Black churches is being consistently challenged by pointing out its shortcomings. And we also have new vocabulary, new grammar, new ways of naming our positions in the world that are enhanced and spread so very effectively through social media. So Black folks know there are options. They know I'm a secular humanist and I'm not alone.
Why is that? Why are more Black people identifying as atheist today? Why is that happening?
Why are more Black folks identifying as atheists today? I think what is happening is a greater degree of comfort with naming what they have been. Right? Black atheists and secular humanists didn't just pop on the scene recently. We have existed, but we've reached a moment in history in which the dominance of the Black church is being legitimately challenged, right? Legitimately challenged. And this has been more graphic over the past 3 decades with the spiritual but not religious, right? Or those who claim no particular religious affiliation. The percentage of Black folks who move in one of those 2 directions is noteworthy. The dominance of the Black church has been fractured. In more recent years, I think some of that is a result of the ways in which Black Lives Matters, for example, has given us opportunity to rethink our engagement with the world and to rethink our meaning-making processes and to think Black life in ways that push against the ways in which Black churches have confined it. It's also the case that if you think in terms of hip hop, a major influence within the context of the United States, there has been a softening, a signifying, a rethinking of these dominant theistic themes. So Tupac is Black Jesus, the patron saint of thugs. Or on Crown, Jay-Z says you're in the presence of a king, scratch that, you're in the presence of a god. Or Kanye West says, I am a god. Right? So you get this kind of rethinking that has been in place for a while. Because the 5%ers, for example, argue we're getting this all wrong because the Black man is God. This is where the Nation of Islam falls short for them. Nation of Islam says you're created in the image of Allah. 5%ers say, no, we are gods, right? So there has been a softening, a reworking, a rethinking of these categories for a good stretch of time.
Okay, so confession time. I'm a Christian. You're probably not surprised by that. But I will say that I've gone through a kind of deconstruction. I don't like that term. I think it's a bit overused. But these, for me, are shifts and evolutions in my faith that often leave me feeling uncomfortable with all of the assumptions and baggage present in calling myself a Christian. Most of that discomfort is because of the way Christians have chosen to represent themselves in politics over the last 20 to 30 years. Christian nationalism is a mind virus. It is a cancer in the church. Titles and nomenclature aside, here's why I still resonate with the Christian faith. I have 3 reasons. First, Christianity is a Middle Eastern, or more accurately, a Near Eastern religion, which means it should be rightly understood within an Eastern framework. For me, in order to give Christianity a fair shake, I have to understand it separately from the bastardized version we know today. I'll come back to that in my 3rd point. The cultural context of the Bible's authors and main characters would not align with the money-hungry, capitalistic structures we know today. This means that success in the biblical narrative exists almost exclusively outside of the confines of worldly possession or wealth accumulation. Our top-down preconception about who is favored and who isn't simply do not fit within the framework of the biblical narrative. In fact, the ultimate main character of the book, Jesus, was a Middle Eastern Jewish man who was born in a barn, lived as a nomad, owned no earthly possessions, believed in sweeping debt forgiveness, and constantly criticized the exploitative practices of businessmen, church grifters, and oppressive governments. Second, and this is connected, I've read the book. Slave owners frequently cut out critical parts of the biblical narrative to stop Black people from learning the whole story. Books like the Exodus were removed from slave Bibles because those stories were too radicalizing for the enslaved to have access to. This is one of the great ironies of the anti-Black book bans taking place across the country. They're acting just like their grandfathers who thought they could ban radicalizing books from the Bible. Slave preachers were brought onto plantations to preach about how the Bible commands the enslaved to obey their masters. That's Ephesians chapter 6. But they were not allowed to preach verses in the book just before, Galatians chapter 3, which says that the slave and the free are made equals in Christ Jesus. When you read the book, the whole book, it is clear that God is squarely on the side of the oppressed and decidedly against the oppressor, even when the oppressors are his people. More on that in a bit. I've read the New Testament, like the book of Luke, where Jesus says that his singular mission is to bring liberation to the oppressed. Jesus goes on to present a powerfully progressive vision of something close to universal health care, debt forgiveness, and a kind of criminal justice reform. The 3rd reason why I still identify as a Christian is a bit more logical and directly connected to reading the book. The Bible presents a narrative of people doing what they want to do, often in direct opposition to what the God of Scripture tells them to do. One could argue that one of the central themes of the Bible is choice and how the divine is navigating people's freedom to choose. From Adam and Eve choosing to eat the forbidden fruit of the garden, to David choosing to step up and fight Goliath, to some people choosing to accept or reject Jesus as the Messiah. Choice is woven throughout the text, and what comes with that choice is a great deal of risk. Human error, exploitation, and wrongdoing are often the fruit of that risk. This is, for me, where faith has its limits, because we all have choices to make. If I choose to harm someone, it doesn't matter how many Bible verses I quote. I will be responsible for my actions. It would be silly for me to place the blame for my actions on God. Similarly, hundreds of years of Europe and the West's nonstop colonial exploitation of African people and land is a choice that has produced far-reaching outcomes to this day. I would challenge you to go back and read the writings of white people living in what would become America in the 1600s and the 1700s. They knew what they were doing. America's enslavement, segregation, mass incarceration, and continued exclusion of Black people is a choice. And if God exists, I don't think it's fair to blame that on them. Anti-Blackness is real, and it isn't of God's making. The Bible basically describes Jesus as a Black person.
In the Bible, is Jesus, is his appearance in the Bible?
I believe they describe him with like
feet were bronze and hair was, yeah.
His feet was black as brass and his hair was that of wool. James Harden? James Harden? LeBron? What?
In some ways, I think this is why Black people are still Christians. The Bible promises a better tomorrow despite the trials of today. And you may scoff at the therapeutic nature of that claim, and I get it. But there's also something powerful about hope. And the Black church, despite all of its flaws, has harnessed that hope, producing art, expression, and movements that have changed the world. Okay, that's it for this one. Thank you for watching and subscribing. I think about faith a lot in real life, but I actually rarely explore those thoughts in my content. So in some ways, this is kind of an experiment. And if you watched to this point, you now know about my little experiment. I'll be checking out the likes and the comments on this video to get a sense of how you're feeling about it. So subscribe, drop a like. And I have to tell you, this isn't a transactional community. We talk, we argue, we disagree. So get into the comments. I'm reading every single one. Would love to know what you're thinking. As always, I'm grateful that you're here, my friends. Peace.